The charges had already been read when Cale Marin entered the chamber. He heard them echoing off the vaulted ceiling as he crossed the threshold, the deep, reedy voice of Prefect Sorvan listing offenses that carried the cadence of ritual, each one landing with the deliberate weight of a body dropping. Sedition against the Conclave, unauthorized communication with quarantined species, violation of Article 19 of the Exile Compact, conspiracy to undermine the sovereign order of the Vethara Conclave. Cale walked, he did not hurry. The Grand Deliberation Chamber was a structure designed to diminish anyone who stood at its center. Tiered seats rose in a wide oval, carved from pale stone veined with silver ore, climbing 7 levels above the main floor. Hundreds of counselors sat in their ceremonial robes, deep indigo for the legislative tier, gray-green for the military advisors, bone-white for the judicial elders. Their faces were uniformly long, angular, the skin a mottled blue-gray stretched over high cranial ridges. Wide-set eyes tracked him with the unsettling synchrony of a school of predatory fish changing direction. Above it all, the glass dome led in the daylight. Harsh and bright, it fell in a wide column onto the central platform where the accused was meant to stand. Through the dome's panels, the sky was a pale violet, cloudless and empty. For now, the accused will approach the judgment dais, Sorvan said. Cale Marin stepped onto the dais. He was 53 years old, lean from years of living on stations that rationed protein by the gram. His dark hair was cut short, shot through with gray at the temples. He wore a plain charcoal suit, no insignia, no rank pins, nothing that marked him as anything more than a civilian summoned to answer. The suit was borrowed. His own clothes had been confiscated when they'd brought him in from the transport. He stood in the light and said nothing. The tiered seats rustled, fabric shifting. A counselor on the third tier leaned toward the one beside her and murmured something behind her hand, four-fingered, the nails filed to ceremonial points. Prefect Sorvan sat at the elevated judicial bench directly ahead, flanked by 2 senior arbiters. His robes were bone-white trimmed with a band of deep crimson, the color of final authority. His cranial ridge was higher than most, the skin there almost translucent, and his eyes had the flat, unblinking quality of someone who had presided over enough judgments to consider them a form of bureaucracy. Cale Marin, he said, formerly senior envoy of the human delegation to the Vethara Conclave, stripped of rank and exiled from sovereign territory by unanimous vote of this body, 14 standard years ago. You have been recalled to face additional charges arising from evidence obtained during your period of exile. Do you understand the proceedings? I understand them. Do you wish to contest the charges? Cale looked at the judicial bench. Then he looked up slowly, deliberately at the tiers of counselors watching him. Row by row, level by level. He let them see him looking, let them understand that a man they'd thrown out was reading the room the way he always had. I do. The rustling stopped. Sorvan's left hand twitched, a small involuntary gesture that, among the Vethara, indicated surprise poorly concealed. He recovered in a breath. You understand that contesting charges before the Conclave carries the additional risk of censure escalation. If your defense is found to be without merit, the tribunal may impose a sentence beyond the original charge. I understand. You further understand that you have no delegation present, no advocate of record, and no standing before this body beyond what the recall summons grants. Cale's expression did not change. I'll represent myself. A sound moved through the tiers, not quite laughter, but something close. It was the Vethara equivalent, a low clicking from the back of the throat, the mandible plates vibrating. Amusement, the kind aimed downward. Sorvan waited for it to subside. Very well. The Conclave recognizes the accused's right to self-representation under Article 7 of the Tribunal Code. Prosecutor Kethon, you may present the evidentiary record. Prosecutor Kethan rose from the bench to Sorvan's left. She was tall even by Vethara standards, her robes a severe charcoal, her cranial ridge shaved smooth in the style of the legal caste. She carried a thin data tablet, but she didn't look at it. She knew her case the way a surgeon knows which artery to cut. "The charges before this body are as follows," Kethan began, her voice projecting cleanly through the chamber's acoustics. During his 14-year exile, the accused maintained covert communication channels with at least 3 species currently under Conclave quarantine: the Tesseract, the Almari, and the Drevani. These communications were not social. They were diplomatic in nature. The accused, despite having been stripped of all authority, continued to negotiate as though he spoke for a sovereign power. She paused, let the chamber absorb it. Furthermore, the accused facilitated the transfer of technical specifications, propulsion data, agricultural yield models, mineral survey coordinates, to quarantined species in violation of the Exile Compact. This constitutes not merely a breach of exile terms but an active conspiracy to build a parallel diplomatic framework outside Conclave authority. Kethan turned to face the tears. The evidence will show that Cale Marin did not simply violate the terms of his exile. He used those 14 years to construct exactly the thing this body voted to prevent: a human sphere of influence operating beyond our reach. The chamber was quiet, the kind of quiet that precedes a verdict already decided. Cale stood on the dais and watched. He did not fidget. He did not look down. He clasped his hands behind his back and waited. "The prosecution calls its first witness," Kethan said, "Intelligence Director Vorath." Vorath descended from the 4th-tier military advisory section, gray-green robes, the bearing of someone who considered courtrooms a step down from operational briefings. His cranial ridge bore the asymmetric scarring of field service, and his hands were thicker than the legislative castes, the nails blunt rather than filed. He took the witness platform adjacent to the dais and stood with those hands folded in front of him, the Vethara posture of official testimony. "Director Vorath," Kethan said, "you oversaw the surveillance operation on the accused during his exile. Summarize your findings." Vorath's voice was clipped precise, each word placed like a riveted plate. "We tracked the accused's movements across 7 systems over 12 of the 14 exile years. In year 2, he established contact with a Tesseract trade delegation on Station Korath, an unregistered meeting in a cargo bay leased under a false commercial name. By year 4, he had opened a dialogue with Almari provincial leaders on 3 separate moons. By year 6, he was meeting regularly with Drevani shipyard engineers at a facility in the Korath Drift. And the nature of these meetings? Diplomatic. The accused was offering partnership terms, trade access, technical cooperation, mutual defense frameworks, terms that implied sovereign authority. He had no authority to offer any of this. He was an exile operating from a bunk on a commercial station. Yet they accepted. Several did. The Tesseract signed a memorandum of understanding with the accused in year 8. The Almari followed in year 9. The Drevani began construction on a joint venture mining platform in year 11. The platform is now operational. It processes rare earth minerals that the Conclave had previously controlled exclusive access to. A stir in the upper tiers, councilors shifting forward. A delegate on the 5th tier pulled up a holographic display on the armrest panel, cross-referencing something. Another on the 6th tier was tapping rapidly, pulling trade ledgers. Kethan pressed, "Director, in your professional assessment, what was the accused building?" Vorath did not hesitate. An alliance, a small one, 3 quarantined species and 1 exiled human with no resources beyond his own persistence, but an alliance nonetheless. Outside Conclave jurisdiction, outside our treaty framework, and with access to resources we had specifically embargoed. "One final question, Director. At any point during your surveillance, did the accused attempt to conceal these activities? Voreth paused the first hesitation. No, he operated openly. He used his real name. He did not encrypt his travel logs. It was as though he expected to be watched and did not care. The clicking from the tiers carried a different note this time. Not amusement, something closer to unease. Thank you, Director. Voreth returned to his tier. Kale watched him go, then he looked at Sorvan. The accused may cross-examine, Sorvan said. Kale's voice was even. No questions for Director Voreth. The clicking sound again, sharper this time, the human declining to challenge the intelligence chief. Some counselors interpreted it as resignation, others as stupidity. A few, on the lower tiers, watched him with the particular stillness of people who were not yet sure what they were watching. Kethon called her second witness, economic analyst Drevon, a data specialist from the Trade Regulatory Division. She ascended the witness platform with a tablet loaded with charts and projections. The trade volumes moving through the accused's informal network, Drevon testified, are currently modest by galactic standards, approximately 4% of Rimward sector mineral output. However, the growth trajectory is significant. At current rates of expansion, the network will control 12 to 15% of Rimward mineral trade within 6 standard years. And the impact on Conclave trade revenues. Direct displacement of embargoed resource flows. The Tesseract ore deposits that the Conclave locked behind quarantine are now being mined and sold through the accused's partnership framework. Revenue that should be flowing through Conclave license channels is being diverted. A counselor on the third tier activated her display and began running calculations, then 2 more on the same tier. The numbers were not abstract, they were budget lines, and budget lines had constituency. The minerals moving through the Exile's network were the same minerals that funded infrastructure projects in 17 Conclave districts. Somewhere on those tiers, representatives of those districts were doing the math and not liking it. Kethon let the numbers breathe. She was a skilled prosecutor, and she knew that economic data landed harder than accusations of ideology. The chamber could dismiss defiance as a personality flaw. It could not dismiss a 4% market share shift with a 12% growth curve. Kale declined to cross-examine. Again, the clicking, and this time, a counselor on the second tier stopped clicking and watched the human with an expression that was closer to curiosity than contempt. The pattern was unusual. An accused who declined to challenge every witness was either defeated or waiting. The second-tier counselor, the elder with the deep ceremonial scars, was beginning to wonder which. Kethon called a communications officer who had intercepted fragments of encoded messages between the accused and Tesseract leadership. The fragments were partial. The Tesseract used a layered cipher system that Conclave intelligence had only partially cracked. But the content that was readable showed coordination on shipping schedules, joint survey missions, and what appeared to be a shared emergency response protocol. A mutual defense clause, Kethon asked. Not in the traditional military sense, the officer said, but functionally, yes. If any partner species faced a threat, the others would respond with material support. Ships, supplies, personnel, a miniature collective security framework. Kale declined to cross-examine. Kethon's fourth witness was a former Conclave clerk who testified that she had seen the accused's name on a classified document 3 years after his exile. A document routing sheet that should not have existed, suggesting that someone within the Conclave had been sharing internal assessments with the exile. I saw the routing code, the clerk said. It matched the accused's old diplomatic identifier. It was on a document classified for internal distribution only. Someone was feeding him information. Kale declined to cross-examine. Each witness built the same picture. A man who had been cast out and refused to stay cast out. who had, in the silence of exile with borrowed clothes and a bunk on a cargo station, constructed something that looked very much like the beginning of a rival order. The evidence was damning by the standards of the charges. Every fact was accurate. Every contact was real. Every partnership documented. And the accused stood on the dais through all of it, hands behind his back, face composed, declining to challenge a single word. With each declined cross-examination, the tears grew more restless. The murmuring shifted register, from the low clicking of satisfied consensus to a higher, more irregular pattern that Cale recognized as unease. 700 counselors were accustomed to defendants who fought, who objected, who challenged testimony and demanded procedural reviews and filed motions that delayed and obstructed and made the chamber's work slow. A defendant who simply listened, who absorbed every accusation without resistance, was behaving outside the expected parameters. It made the chamber nervous in a way it could not quite articulate. By the fourth witness, even Sorvan looked faintly puzzled, though his expression shifted by fractions so small that only someone who had spent years reading Vethara faces, had sat across from them in trade negotiations and treaty debates, and the 100 small humiliations that the Conclave considered standard protocol for client species delegations, would have caught it. Cale caught it. He had been catching Vethara micro-expressions for 20 years, and the one crossing Sorvan's face now was the one that translated roughly as, "Why isn't he fighting?" "The prosecution rests," Kethan said, with the satisfaction of someone who had laid bricks in a straight line and knew the wall was solid. She returned to the bench with the measured stride of a professional who had done her job and expected the bench to do its. Sorvan turned to the dais. The accused may now present his defense. Cale Marin unclasped his hands from behind his back. He took one step forward on the dais, placing himself squarely in the column of light from the dome above. The daylight caught the gray in his hair and the lines around his eyes and the calm, unhurried set of his jaw. "I'd like to call my first witness," he said. Sorvan's mandible plates tightened, a rapid contraction visible from the floor. "You have no advocate and no witnesses of record. The tribunal was not notified of any defense witnesses." "Article 7, Section 4, Cale said. "An accused representing themselves may call witnesses from any party present in the chamber, provided the witness has direct knowledge of the matters at issue." Silence. Sorvan looked at the arbiter to his left, who consulted a tablet and gave a small nod, reluctant, but procedurally bound. "The provision is valid," Sorvan said slowly. "Whom do you wish to call?" "Counselor Drethon. Third tier, 7th seat." Every head in the chamber turned, a synchronized motion, hundreds of cranial ridges swiveling, wide-set eyes locking onto a single point in the legislative section. Counselor Drethon, a mid-ranking legislative member, indigo robes, her cranial ridge marked with the thin ceremonial scars of the traitor caste, went absolutely still. Her four-fingered hands gripped her armrests. "This is irregular," Kethan said sharply, already on her feet. "It is within the code," Sorvan replied, though his tone carried the weight of someone who wished it were not. "Counselor Drethon, please take the witness platform." Drethon descended. Her movements were controlled, the careful, deliberate gait of a Vethara under public scrutiny. But her hands gripped the railing of the witness platform a fraction too tightly, the filed nails pressing pale marks into the polished stone. Cale turned to face her. "Counselor Drethon, 14 years ago you voted to exile me from Conclave territory. Do you recall the specific grounds?" "The charges were clear. You were found to have exceeded your diplomatic mandate." "Exceeded it how?" "You proposed a mutual defense treaty between humanity and the Conclave. You did not have authorization from your government to propose such a treaty. You acted unilaterally." "And the Conclave's position on such a treaty?" Drethon paused, a fraction of a second longer than conversational. It was rejected. Unanimously. A longer pause. Yes. Because the Conclave did not want a mutual defense arrangement with humanity. Because my proposal implied that humanity might be a military partner rather than a managed client species. And that implication was considered, in the Conclave's judgment, dangerous. Kethon stood. The accused is testifying, not questioning. I'll rephrase, Kale said, his voice unchanged. Counselor Drethon was the primary concern of this body when it voted to exile me, that a mutual defense treaty would elevate humanity's standing from client to partner. Drethon's wide-set eyes moved to the judicial bench, seeking guidance. Sorvon said nothing. The arbiters said nothing. The chamber said nothing. The concern, Drethon said carefully, was that the treaty exceeded the scope of the human delegation's mandate. That was the stated concern. Was it the actual concern? I don't understand the distinction you are drawing. Kale's voice did not rise. It stayed level, quiet, carrying the way a voice does when a chamber of 700 people has gone completely silent, and the acoustics have nowhere to diffuse the sound. Let me help with the distinction. I'd like to enter into evidence a document I obtained during my exile, a copy of the Conclave's internal strategic assessment of humanity, classified as Directive 17, authored 6 months before my exile vote. The chamber erupted. Not in shouting, the Vithara did not shout, but in the rapid clicking of mandible plates across 7 tiers, the shifting of hundreds of robed bodies, the simultaneous activation of dozens of holographic armrest displays, as counselors searched their own archives for any record of a document they had never been told existed. Kethon was on her feet, her shaved cranial ridge catching the light as she stepped toward the dais. This is not in the evidentiary record. The tribunal has no notice of this document. It cannot be admitted. Article 7, Section 6, Kale said. A self-representing defendant may introduce documentary evidence at any point during the defense phase, provided the document is authenticated by the chamber's own verification system. And how is it authenticated? Sorvon demanded. His mandible plates were locked now, pressed tight against his jawline, the Vithara equivalent of a clenched jaw. By the Conclave's own encryption signature, the document carries your seal prefect. Your office authored it. The silence that followed was of a different quality entirely. It was the silence of a room that has just heard the floor crack beneath it and is waiting to see which direction the break runs. Sorvon's expression was unreadable, deliberately, professionally unreadable, the mask of a judicial authority who has practiced neutrality the way a musician practices scales. His mandible plates moved once, then stilled. Present the document. Kale reached into the inner pocket of his borrowed charcoal suit and produced a thin data chip. He held it for a moment, visible to every tier, a small translucent rectangle catching the daylight from the dome, then placed it on the evidence pedestal at the edge of the dais. The chamber's authentication system engaged. A holographic field scanned the chip, compared its encryption markers against the Conclave's master verification database, and projected the result above the dais in pale blue light. Classification, Sovereign Directive. Designation, SD-17. Origin, Office of the Prefect, Vithara Conclave. Subject, Strategic Containment Assessment, Species 4471, Human. Authentication, VERIFID, Conclave cipher match confirmed. Section 3, Kale said. The summary paragraph. 700 pairs of wide-set eyes read the same words simultaneously, the holographic projection hanging in the air above the dais, pale blue against the bright daylight pouring through the dome. The projection read, the human species presents a unique strategic challenge. Unlike prior client species, humans demonstrate adaptive capacity across diplomatic, military, and economic domains simultaneously. Containment is recommended over integration. The current delegation should be reduced in scope, and the senior envoy's influence curtailed through procedural action. Full exile is the preferred mechanism, as it carries minimal political cost and maximum suppressive effect. The chamber did not click, it did not murmur. It sat in the kind of stillness that descends when 700 individuals simultaneously realize that the record they are looking at is their own, and it says what they hoped it did not say. Drethon, still on the witness platform, had gone very pale, her blue-gray skin losing its modeling, becoming flat and ashen, the blood retreating from the surface the way it does in Vethara under acute stress. Kale let the silence hold for 5 full seconds. He counted them internally the way he'd counted everything during 14 years of exile, deliberately, precisely, knowing that timing mattered more than volume. Then he spoke. My exile was not a judicial action. It was a containment strategy. This body did not exile me because I exceeded my mandate. This body exiled me because I was effective, and that frightened someone in this room. This is a mischaracterization, Kethon said, but her voice had lost the prosecutorial edge. She was recalculating. The data tablet in her hand had become irrelevant. Her case was built on the foundation that the exile was legitimate, and the foundation had just shown cracks. Is it? Kale turned back to Drethon. Counselor, did you receive a briefing on Directive 17 before the exile vote? Drethon's filed nails pressed into the platform railing. Many documents circulate before any vote. I cannot recall every briefing. Let me be more specific. 6 months before the exile vote, your office received a classified distribution from the Prefect's Strategic Planning Division. The distribution list is attached to Directive 17. Your name is on it. Shall I display the distribution list? Drethon did not answer immediately. Her mandible plates moved in a rapid, involuntary pattern, the Vethara tell for someone whose composure is under structural load. I may have seen a summary, she said. A summary of a document that explicitly recommended my exile as a, and I quote from the directive, suppressive mechanism with minimal political cost. And you voted accordingly. Drethon said nothing. No further questions for this witness, Kale said. Drethon returned to her seat on the 3rd tier. She did not look at the counselors on either side of her. They did not look at her either, which was its own kind of answer. Kale did not pause to let the moment settle. He turned back toward the judicial bench. I'd like to call a second witness, Director Vorath. The military advisory tier stirred. Vorath, who had already testified for the prosecution, looked at Kethon. Kethon looked at Sorvan. The procedural question hung in the air like smoke. The witness has already testified, Kethon said. For the prosecution, Article 7, Section 4 permits the defense to call any party present in the chamber. It does not exclude prior witnesses. The senior arbiter consulted her tablet, her calcified cranial ridge catching the overhead light. She nodded, again reluctantly, again bound by the code that the Conclave had written for itself, and apparently never expected to have turned against it with this kind of precision. Vorath descended to the witness platform for the 2nd time. His posture was unchanged, blunt-nailed hands folded, field-scarred cranial ridge level. But his eyes tracked Kale with a wariness that had not been there during his first appearance. Director Vorath, Kale said, you testified that your surveillance tracked me across 7 systems over 12 years, openly, under my own name. That is correct. You testified that I did not encrypt my travel logs or conceal my meetings. Correct. In 12 years of surveillance, did your division ever attempt to intervene? To disrupt my meetings with the Tesseract, the Almari, or the Drevani? To notify the quarantined species that their communications with me were being monitored? Vorath's folded hands shifted, a subtle repositioning. Our mandate was observation, not intervention. Observation for 12 years. 12 years of watching me build partnerships that you have now described as a threat to Conclave authority. And in all that time, your division filed no recommendation for early recall. No advisory to the prefect suggesting that the situation warranted action. You simply watched. Intelligence operations are strategic in nature. The timing of action is. The timing of action was determined by the prefect's intercepted message, which specified recall only when my network began to threaten Conclave trade revenues. You weren't watching me because I was a security threat. You were watching me because someone wanted to know when I became an economic one. Voreth's mandible plates tightened. He did not respond. One more question, Director. During your 12 years of surveillance, did you at any point observe me engaging in military activity, weapons procurement, fleet coordination, any action that could be characterized as preparation for conflict? The pause was heavy. 700 counselors waited. No, Voreth said. No weapons, no military coordination, no fleet, just meetings, handshakes. Memoranda of understanding, agricultural partnerships and mining cooperatives. That is what the surveillance showed. Thank you, Director. Voreth returned to the fourth tier. The military counselors on either side of him shifted in their seats, a subtle but visible repositioning. The way officers move when the ground they are standing on has changed elevation without warning. Cale turned to face the tiers directly. 7 levels of indigo, gray-green, and bone-white, every face watching him. The holographic projection of Directive 17 still floating above the dais like an accusation made of light. I'd like to address the second category of charges, he said. Unauthorized contact with quarantined species. He placed a second data chip on the evidence pedestal. The authentication system engaged. A new holographic projection appeared, a list of species designations, each with a quarantine classification code, a date, and a brief rationale summary. The Tesseract, Cale said, were quarantined 9 years ago. The stated reason was failure to comply with revised treaty obligations. The actual reason, documented in the Conclave's own Internal Trade Commission minutes, which I obtained through a source I will not name, was that the Tesseract refused to sign the revised Mineral Rights Treaty, a treaty that would have granted the Conclave exclusive access to their primary rhodium class ore deposits at below-market compensation rates. He let the counselors read. On the 5th tier, a trade committee member was already pulling up her own archived copy of the revised treaty, comparing terms. Her display showed the compensation schedules side by side, what the Tesseract would have received, and what the same ore was worth on the open market. The gap was visible even at a distance. When the Tesseract refused those terms, Cale continued, the Conclave did not renegotiate. It did not offer revised compensation. It quarantined an entire species and declared their trade routes off-limits. The Tesseract's ore deposits are still there. Their mining infrastructure is still functional. The only thing that changed was that nobody in Conclave space was permitted to buy from them. Until I showed up. A counselor on the 4th tier, military advisory, but one of the logistics officers who tracked supply chains rather than fleet deployments, pulled up a resource dependency analysis on her display. She studied it for 3 seconds, then looked at the counselor beside her and said something too quiet to carry to the floor, but her expression carried. The Almari were quarantined 12 years ago for, and the stated reason is instructive, development of proscribed technology. The technology in question was an independent propulsion system that exceeded the capability threshold the Conclave sets for non-member species. The Almari did not violate any law. They violated a capability ceiling that exists nowhere in the Conclave Charter, but is enforced through administrative regulation. They built engines that were too good, and they were locked out of galactic trade for it. A stir on the second tier. A legislative elder with deep ceremonial scars pulled up the proscribed technology list on her armrest display and began scrolling. Her mandible plates moved in what Kale recognized as the expression the Vethara used when discovering that something they had taken for granted was, on closer inspection, poorly constructed. For context, Kale added, the Almari propulsion system that triggered their quarantine has a fuel efficiency rating 23% higher than the current Conclave standard. The Conclave's own engineering division has since attempted to develop a comparable drive. They have not succeeded. The proscribed technology that this body locked behind a quarantine wall was better than anything the Conclave has built. And instead of licensing it, the Conclave buried it and punished the people who created it. On the military advisory tier, two officers exchanged a glance. Fuel efficiency was not an abstract number for fleet logistics. It was range. It was operational reach. It was the difference between a supply line that held and one that broke. The Drevani were quarantined 7 years ago for lodging a formal complaint with the Interstellar Mediation Authority regarding conclave trade practices. Specifically, the practice of setting procurement prices for quarantined species goods at rates that constituted, in the Drevani's words, economic coercion. Their quarantine was enacted 3 days after the complaint was filed. He paused, let the number sit. On the 6th tier, a judicial elder pulled up the Drevani quarantine order and cross-referenced it against the mediation authority's filing timestamp. The elder's mandible plates parted, the Vethara expression that came before a question nobody wanted to ask. She turned her display so the counselor beside her could see it. Then the counselor beside her turned it toward the next. The timestamp spread through the 6th tier like a crack through ice. 3 days. The quarantine order had been drafted before the complaint was formally received by the mediation authority. The filing date on the quarantine was 3 days after the complaint, but the document's creation metadata showed it had been authored 5 days before. Someone in the prefect's office had known the complaint was coming and had prepared the response in advance. 3 days, he repeated, for the tiers who might have missed it. The Drevani filed a complaint about unfair pricing. 3 days later, they were cut off from every trade route the Conclave controls. The complaint was subsequently withdrawn. Because it is difficult to pursue a legal grievance when the party you are filing against controls your access to food imports. The stir spread. Counselors on the legislative tier were leaning forward, some of them pulling up the quarantine records on their own displays, checking the dates against the projections above the dais. On the military advisory tier, a senior officer had stopped watching Kale entirely and was reading her own screen with the focused intensity of someone who has just discovered a structural deficiency in something she was told was sound. Kale's voice remained level. It had not risen once since he began speaking. It would not rise. That was the point, had always been the point. 14 years of exile had taught him many things, and the most important was that the Vethara heard volume as desperation and silence as strength. These were not quarantines imposed for security violations, he said. These were quarantines imposed on species that refused to comply with Conclave economic control. The same mechanism used on me, exile as containment, applied to entire civilizations. Kethan rose. The quarantine decisions are separate proceedings. They are not within the scope of this tribunal. They are directly within scope, Kale said. The charges against me include unauthorized contact with quarantined species. The validity of those charges depends on the validity of the quarantines themselves. If the quarantines were imposed as economic punishment rather than security measures, then my contact with those species was not a violation of security protocol. It was diplomacy with free peoples who had been wrongly isolated. On the 5th tier, the Trade Committee member who had been cross-referencing the revised Mineral Rights Treaty spoke to the counselor beside her, not a whisper, but a statement made at conversational volume, deliberately audible to the tiers below. The compensation clause in the revised Tesseract Treaty was set at 31% of market rate. 31%. The number traveled through the legislative tier like a current through water. 31%. Councilors who had voted to approve the quarantine without reading the underlying treaty terms were now reading them. Some of them were reading them for the first time. On the third tier, a councilor closed his holographic display and sat back in his seat with his arms folded, not the Vethara posture of withdrawal, but of a person who has just finished a calculation and does not like the result. Kethon remained standing but did not speak. The prosecution's position required the quarantines to be legitimate. The quarantines were looking less legitimate by the minute, and there was no procedural motion that could put the numbers back in their classified files. Sorvan's right hand clenched on the arm of his judicial bench. The gesture was small, but Kale saw it. So did the arbiters flanking him. The senior arbiter, an ancient Vethara whose cranial ridge had calcified to opaque white, glanced at the prefect's hand and then looked away, her expression carefully neutral. "The tribunal will consider the relevance," Sorvan said. His voice was still controlled, but the bureaucratic cadence was gone. Something harder was underneath, and Kale had been listening for it. "I have one more piece of evidence," Kale said. He did not reach for it immediately. He stood on the dais in the column of daylight, and he let the chamber wait. 2 seconds. 3. Long enough for 700 councilors to register that the pause was deliberate, that the man on the dais was controlling the tempo of a proceeding that was supposed to be controlled by the bench. Then he reached into his jacket, the borrowed charcoal suit with no insignia, no rank, nothing but whatever he had carried into this chamber in his own pockets, and produced a third data chip. He held it up, visible to every tier, a thin translucent rectangle between his thumb and forefinger catching the daylight. "This is a communication intercept," he said. "Not from Conclave intelligence, from the Tesseract Signals Corps. They intercepted it 16 months ago and shared it with me because it concerned them. It concerned all of us." He placed it on the pedestal. The authentication scan completed. The holographic projection shifted. It was a message, an internal Conclave communication, routed through a diplomatic back channel, carrying Sorvan's personal cipher. The authentication system confirmed the cipher match without hesitation. The pale blue VERIFIED tag appeared beside the document header. The message was addressed to the military advisory tier, the gray-green section on levels 4 and 5. It read, "The human exile has exceeded acceptable parameters. The informal network he has constructed among quarantined species now represents a potential challenge to Conclave trade authority in the rimward sectors. Recommend recall under additional charges. Tribunal outcome is predetermined. The objective is permanent detention, not adjudication. Ensure the military advisory tier is briefed accordingly." The chamber did not breathe. 700 Vethara sat in their tiered seats, indigo, gray-green, bone-white, and looked at the projection floating above the dais, pale blue against the bright daylight from the dome, and they read it, and they read it again, and the words did not change. Tribunal outcome is predetermined. The objective is permanent detention, not adjudication. The silence was not the silence of deliberation. It was the silence of a body discovering that the verdict it was assembled to deliver had been written without its consent, and that the proceeding it was participating in was not a trial but a performance in which it had been cast without audition. On the third tier, Councillor Drethon, who had already been pale, closed her holographic display and placed both hands flat on her armrests, the Vethara posture of someone physically steadying themselves. On the fifth tier, the trade committee member who had spoken aloud about the 31% compensation rate was reading the intercepted message for the third time, her mandible plates absolutely motionless. The stillness that comes after the clicking stops, when a Vethara has moved past surprise into something colder. On the military advisory fourth tier, 3 officers were looking at each other with the flat, assessing gaze of people who had just been told they were briefed accordingly, and were now considering what, exactly, they had been briefed to do. Kethan, the prosecutor, set her data tablet face down on the bench. The motion was small, but in a chamber where every gesture carried weight, it was the equivalent of a closing argument withdrawn. Sorvan's face had gone rigid. The translucent skin over his cranial ridge showed the blood vessels beneath, a network of dark lines pulsing visibly, the Vethara equivalent of a flush that could not be concealed by any amount of judicial composure. "This document is unverified," he said. "It carries your personal cipher," Kale said. "The same cipher your own authentication system just confirmed. If it's falsified, order a cryptographic audit, right now, in front of the chamber." Sorvan did not order an audit. The silence stretched. On the fourth tier in the military advisory section, a senior officer leaned back in her seat and crossed her arms, the Vethara gesture of withdrawal from a position previously held. The officer beside her noticed and did the same. Then a third. A counselor on the second tier legislative section, an elder with deep ceremonial scars on her cranial ridge, and the bearing of someone who had held her seat for decades, stood. Standing during testimony was unusual in the conclave. Standing uninvited, without recognition from the bench, was a breach of protocol so severe it carried its own constitutional weight. "I request a recess," she said, her voice cutting through the stillness, "and an independent review of all documents presented during this proceeding." Another counselor stood. Third tier, then a fourth on the fifth tier, then 7 more, scattered across the legislative and military sections, rising from their seats like markers being placed on a map. Sorvan's hand moved toward the gavel, a polished stone instrument shaped like a tapered cylinder, the traditional tool of judicial authority in Vethara proceedings. He gripped it. He did not strike it. Kale spoke into the stillness. "I don't want a recess." Every standing counselor turned to look at him. Every seated counselor who had been looking at the projections shifted their attention back to the dais. The chamber focused on the human the way a lens focuses light, all of it, concentrated on one point. "I was exiled from this chamber 14 years ago. I was told I had overstepped. I was told I was dangerous. I was told that my proposal, a mutual defense treaty, an offer of partnership between equals, was an act of aggression against the Conclave's sovereign order." He looked at the tiers, row by row, level by level. "I spent those 14 years in exile. No rank, no delegation, no credentials. I lived on stations where the water tasted like recycled coolant and the protein came in blocks. And in those years, I built partnerships, not because I was defying the Conclave, but because the species I found out there had been cut off and locked out, and nobody was coming for them. The Tesseract mining crews, the Almari engineers, the Drevani farmers who couldn't sell their harvests because every trade route ran through your checkpoints. They were alone." He stopped. "Let the chamber hold the weight of it. I came for them, because that's what diplomats do." The tiers were listening with a different quality of attention now. The attention of a room that has stopped evaluating an argument and started listening to a person. Kale continued, "The prosecution has presented evidence of my activities during exile. I do not dispute that evidence. Every contact, every meeting, every memorandum of understanding, it happened. I did those things openly, under my own name, because I was not ashamed of them." He turned to face the judicial bench directly. Sorvan's eyes met his across the chamber floor, the prefect elevated on his bench, the exile standing below on the dais, the column of daylight between them making the dust motes visible, drifting slowly in the still air. "But the question before this tribunal is not whether I built an alliance. The question is whether this body has the moral authority to punish me for it." He gestured toward the holographic projection still floating above the dais. The directive, the quarantine records, the intercepted message, all of them glowing in pale blue, authenticated by the Conclave's own systems, carrying the Conclave's own seals. Directive 17 shows my exile was a containment strategy, not a judicial action. The quarantine records show 3 species punished for economic independence, for building good engines, for refusing bad deals, for filing lawful complaints. And the prefect's own message shows this tribunal was staged. The verdict was written before I walked through those doors. He lowered his hand. So I ask this body, not the bench, not the prefect, but the 700 counselors sitting in these tiers who swore an oath to the Conclave Charter, what kind of order are you running? Because I've seen yours from the outside now. I've seen it from the stations your quarantines cut off, from the workshops where quarantined engineers build with whatever they can scavenge, from the farms where quarantined families grow food they can't sell, because you closed every market that would take it. I've seen your order from underneath. And then I've seen the one I built with 3 quarantined species and a cargo station bunk. And I can tell you which one has a future. The elder on the second tier, the one who had stood and requested a recess, looked at Sorvan. Her expression was unreadable to anyone unfamiliar with Vethara affect, but Kale had spent his career reading those faces, and he read hers now. She was furious, not at him. A counselor on the 4th tier, military advisory, gray-green robes, the asymmetric scarring of a fleet officer, spoke without standing. A breach of protocol so severe that heads across all 7 tiers turned toward the sound. "Prefect, did you author the intercepted communication?" Sorvan's gavel hand was white-knuckled on the stone instrument. "The question is out of order. Did you author it? This tribunal is in session. The accused is presenting his defense. Questions from the tiers will be held until the deliberation phase." "Prefect." The military counselor's voice was flat, the tone of someone who has spent a career giving orders and recognizes when authority has become performance. "We are in deliberation. Whether you called it or not." Holographic displays on armrests across the chamber activated in waves, spreading outward from the 2nd and 4th tiers. Counselors pulling up the directive, cross-referencing the quarantine dates, running the cipher authentication through their own terminals. The results came back in real time, pale blue confirmation on dozens of panels across 7 tiers. Authenticated, authenticated, authenticated. Kale stood on the dais and watched the chamber do the work he had set in motion. He did not speak. The documents were speaking. On the 6th tier, a judicial elder placed the original exile vote record beside Directive 17's date stamp. The directive was dated 11 days before the vote. The elder's mandible plates clicked, something colder than amusement. Sorvan struck the gavel. The stone cracked against its base with a sound that carried through the entire chamber, silencing the murmur of holographic searches and whispered consultations. 700 faces turned to the judicial bench. "This tribunal will recess," Sorvan said. "The defense evidence will be submitted to an independent review panel. The accused will be remanded to secure custody pending the review's completion." "No." The voice came from the 2nd tier, the elder with the ceremonial scars. She was standing again, and this time she was not alone. 11 counselors on the 2nd tier stood with her, then 4 on the 3rd, then 7 on the 4th. They rose from their seats with the deliberate, constitutional weight of people who understood that standing in this chamber was not a gesture but a vote. "Under Article 12 of the Conclave Charter," the elder said, her voice carrying to every tier with the practiced projection of a legislator who had spoken in this chamber for 40 years. "A plurality of the legislative tier may call an immediate vote of confidence in the presiding judicial authority. I invoke Article 12. Sorvan's gavel hand stopped. His mandible plates locked in a formation Kale had never seen in any Vithara, a rigid, asymmetric freeze that communicated neither composure nor panic, but something between. The expression of a person watching a mechanism they designed begin to operate against them. This is unprecedented in an active tribunal. This is the charter, the elder said. Your charter, prefect. The one you cited when you authorized the exile. The one you apparently forgot applies to you as well. The senior arbiter spoke, the first time she had addressed the chamber without being asked. Article 12 is valid. A plurality of the legislative tier may invoke at any point during formal session. The invocation cannot be tabled, deferred, or ruled out of order. Voting is immediate. Sorvan looked at her. She met his gaze with the impassive calm of a judicial officer who had served longer than the prefect and would serve after he was gone. The vote was not close. It moved through the tiers like a wave, holographic panels lighting up in sequence. The legislative tier, 271 against confidence out of 312 cast. The military advisory tier, 109 against out of 141. The judicial elders abstained, protocol required it, but their abstention carried its own message. The total hung in pale blue numerals above the prefect's head. The margin was structurally humiliating. Kale watched the numbers appear. He had not voted. He had no vote. He was still in exile in a borrowed suit. But the numbers were his work, set in motion by the simple act of showing 700 people what their own institution had been doing without their knowledge. Sorvan set down the gavel. He placed both hands flat on the bench surface, the polished dark stone that had been the platform of his authority for 2 decades, and he looked at the numbers projected above his own head for a long moment. Then he stood. He removed the crimson band from his robe, the band of final authority, the mark of the Conclave's highest judicial office, and placed it on the bench. He descended from the judicial platform without ceremony, walked along the lower aisle between the first tier and the main floor, and exited the chamber through the rear doors. He did not speak. The chamber watched him go. 700 counselors, the arbiters, the prosecutor, the witnesses who remained, all of them watched the rear doors close behind the prefect with the particular attention that a body gives to the departure of someone it has just removed. The elder from the second tier turned to the 2 remaining arbiters on the judicial bench. The tribunal authority passes to the senior arbiter under succession protocol. The charges against the accused remain technically open. The senior arbiter, the ancient Vithara whose cranial ridge had calcified to opaque white, looked down at Kale Marin standing on the dais. She studied him for a long moment, the way one studies a structural element that has performed beyond its rated specifications and may need to be reclassified. The charges, she said, are predicated on the validity of the exile order and the legitimacy of the quarantine designations. Both are now subject to independent review in light of the evidence presented. Until that review is complete, the charges against the accused are suspended. She paused. The accused is released from custody. Kale Marin stood in the column of daylight from the dome. He did not smile. He did not exhale in relief. He did not look at the tiers for approval or at the bench for validation. He nodded once, a small, precise movement, the acknowledgement of a professional whose case has been heard. The elder from the second tier descended to the main floor and stopped 3 meters from Kale. You built an alliance, she said, with species we quarantined. I built partnerships with people who needed someone willing to sit at the table with them. And now you have a choice. The Tesseract, the Almari, and the Dravani are not enemies. They never were. I can introduce you. Or you can re-quarantine them and watch what happens when people who have already been abandoned once decide they have nothing left to lose. The elder's mandible plates shifted. You expect us to negotiate with quarantined species on terms set by an exile. I expect you to negotiate. The terms are theirs. And if we refuse? You won't refuse. Those ships in your sky represent trade routes your economy needs. The rimward mineral supply chain has been shifting for 3 years. Your commodity analysts have noticed. The network I built gave the quarantined species an alternative, and alternatives have a way of becoming preferences. A sound from above, from outside the dome. The elder looked up. So did the counselors on the nearest tiers, then the ones above them, then the entire chamber, 700 faces tilting skyward in sequence like a field of instruments recalibrating toward a new signal source. Through the glass dome against the pale violet sky, shapes were appearing. Dark silhouettes dropping through the upper atmosphere, cargo vessels, broad-hulled and heavy. Tesseract freighters by the angular hull geometry. Almari courier ships with their distinctive triple-fin stabilizers. Dravani long-range haulers, not warships. Freighters, transports, agricultural haulers, the infrastructure of a functioning economy. There were hundreds of them. The elder stared at the sky, then she looked back at Kale. You said you built partnerships. I did. When you were recalled for this tribunal, you knew this would happen. You planned for them to arrive. I didn't plan it. I told them I'd been recalled, and I told them what the charges were, and I told them what Sorvan's message said about the predetermined outcome. They decided to come on their own. That's what partners do. When one of them is in trouble, the others show up. The elder looked up at the sky again. The fleet, if it could be called that, this armada of civilian vessels, this proof of an economic alliance that had been built in silence and exile, and was now filling the sky above the Conclave's own capital chamber, continued to descend through the atmosphere. You had no delegation, the elder said quietly. No advocate, no standing, no credentials. I had 3 species who trust me, Kale said. That was enough. On the 4th tier, the military counselor who had demanded to know if Sorvan authored the intercepted message was watching the sky through the dome with the expression of an officer reassessing a threat board. Except these were not threats. They were grain ships and ore haulers and courier vessels running regular supply routes, the visible proof of an economy that had been operating in silence, while the Conclave debated quarantine enforcement schedules in chambers just like this one. On the 2nd tier, a younger counselor turned to the elder beside her. How long has this network been operational? The elder did not answer. She looked at Kale, standing on the floor below, and the question answered itself. 14 years, the entire duration of his exile. Every day that this chamber had considered the human question closed, the human in question had been building. The chamber was still. The holographic projections had been dismissed. No one was searching archives anymore. The pale blue light was gone. Only the daylight from the dome remained, falling on the dais where a man in a borrowed suit stood with his hands at his sides, watching the sky fill with the ships of people he had spent 14 years refusing to abandon. A counselor on the 5th tier, one of the younger ones, indigo robes with minimal ceremonial scarring, spoke. Her voice was clear enough to reach the floor. The review of the quarantine designations. How long does standard review take? The senior arbiter on the bench consulted her tablet. Standard review timelines are 60 to 90 days. Accelerated, 30 days, and include the exile order in the scope. The arbiter looked at the remaining counselors, the 2nd tier elder, the military advisory tier. The legislative body, row after row, the clicking and murmuring resolved into something quieter and harder. The sound of a body arriving at consensus, not through procedure, but through the accumulated weight of what it had just witnessed. 30 days, the arbiter said. The review will encompass all quarantine designations enacted in the past 15 standard years, as well as the original exile order. Cale Marin stepped off the dais. His shoes, also borrowed, a half-size too large, made a quiet sound on the polished stone floor. He walked toward the main doors of the chamber, the same doors he had entered through less than an hour ago as an accused man with no standing and no advocate and no future beyond whatever verdict had been written for him in advance. He passed the tiers. 7 levels of counselors watched him go, some with the flat, unreadable expression that was the Vethara default, some with mandible plates shifting in the complex patterns that carried, depending on caste dialect and social context, meanings ranging from grudging respect to the specific discomfort of having been outmaneuvered by someone who was not supposed to have any pieces left on the board. He did not look up at them. He looked ahead at the doors and through the gaps in the architecture where the daylight streamed in, and beyond the daylight, the violet sky filling with ships. The elder from the second tier called after him, "Marin." He stopped. He did not turn fully, just angled his head a quarter turn enough to hear. "The Conclave may wish to send a delegation to meet your partners, if the review proceeds as expected." Cale was quiet for a moment. The ships were visible through the doorway now, a cargo hauler descending low enough that its shadow passed across the chamber's outer courtyard, darkening the corridor for a breath before the daylight returned. "Tell them to bring a fair offer this time," he said. "They'll know the difference." He walked through the doors and into the corridor beyond. The corridor was cooler than the chamber, the pale cyan of institutional lighting, the faint hum of atmospheric processors cycling air 4 degrees below human comfort. He had spent his entire diplomatic career slightly cold in this building. The sensation was so familiar it felt like coming home. Through the tall windows lining the passage, the sky was filling with ships, tesseract freighters in loose formation, Almery couriers darting between them, hull plating catching the atmospheric light. He stopped at one of the windows and stood there for a moment, hands in the pockets of the borrowed suit, watching them descend. 14 years. He had not done it for this moment. He had done it because the work was there and nobody else was doing it, and because the thing that made him dangerous to the Conclave was the same thing that made him useful to the people they had abandoned. He did not stop. He turned from the window and continued toward the atrium. Behind him, through the walls, the chamber was still in session. He could hear the faintest vibration of 700 voices, finding their way toward a decision that would have been unthinkable an hour ago. Behind him, the grand deliberation chamber sat with its dome full of sky and ships, and was beginning to understand that the choice before it was not whether to negotiate, but how quickly it could learn to do so with partners who had every reason to refuse. The elder stood on the main floor for a long time after the doors closed. She looked at the evidence pedestal, still holding 3 data chips. She looked at the judicial bench, where the crimson band of authority lay folded on the polished surface, unclaimed. Then she looked up through the dome, where the ships were settling into patient, visible orbit. She turned and ascended to her tier. There was work to do. Above the dome, the ships held position, unhurried, visible, and in the chamber below, 700 counselors sat with the understanding that the man they had exiled had come back, not armed with anything more dangerous than their own words, and he had been right. That was the part they would have to learn to carry.